80% of our intelligence in World War II came from photo reconnaissance and photo interpretation. And it's not too surprising you haven't heard about it. Bletchley Park had 588 books written about it. Medmenham, 4. And none of them are still in print. And my references tonight is one book that's not in print. I bought you, Spies in the Sky, and the British Commission for Military History, the BBC, and the History Today mag. I don't know whether you get it or not. First, 1941, they had 2 sections of photo interpretation, one in Heston, which later became Heathrow, and Wembley. But they continued to get bombed. So they found a central location and moved them into Danesfield Mansion at Medmenham Village. Mixture of people, almost comical. The analysts were from a rather eclectic group of academics, eccentrics, and mavericks who literally invented the new science, photo interpretation. There were archaeologists, as a matter of fact, the whole department at Cambridge. Geologists, aerial surveyors, mathematicians, artists, motion picture technicians, actors, musicians, composers, cartoonists, and various other scholars, and some prominent people. Sarah Churchill, Dick Bogart, who was a professional actress and actor, and Elliot Roosevelt. Initially, they couldn't commission them because the RAF required 6 months of service before he could be commissioned. So they initially hired a lot of these people as civilians. But later on, a fellow by the name of Cotton, who we'll meet later, got RAF to change, and they decided to stop requiring what they call square bashing and just put them straight in uniform and send them to work. The women were the best analysts because they noticed and paid more attention to tiny details, much like wives do about husbands' grooming. It was the only service branch with gender equality, and a lot of the women, the WAF, WAAF, were outranking and in command of the men in RAF. I worked with nurses that outranked me, but would pay less than I was. Now, you're too old to remember the old-fashioned stereoscope. But back before television, they had a stereoscope. The thing that you look through, and you have this big card, and you look at the big cards, and you'd see the picture in 3D.
Stereoptic.
Remember that?
Yep.
Well, that's what they used here. They were able to have 3D images from a 60% between plate overlap. They could read the smallest detail with this with incredible accuracy. They could calculate the speed of ships, monitor aircraft production, shipbuilding, development of new aircraft and weapons, factory construction and effectiveness of the bombing attacks, and speed of rebuilding the factories. They missed almost nothing in occupied Europe. By the end of the war, they had 1,700 people in this little village interpreting these photographs. They had a daily intake of 60,000 prints. They processed a total of about 5 million during the war. The photo interpretation was a forgotten skill after World War I. They just didn't use it, didn't pay any attention to it. So they were in short supply. Photo reconnaissance was used a lot in World War I, and it was very helpful to make maps of trenches and enemy positions, but most of the knowledge about interpreting the photograph was lost. They had a camera bolted to the outside of the fuselage, and the pilot would reach over and operate the camera, and they got really pretty good pictures because obviously they were flying at a low altitude, so they didn't have a problem with condensation. The earliest use of photo reconnaissance, of course, was with the hot air balloons, like we did in our Civil War. And the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s. Of course, they made an easy target. At the start of World War II, they were using Blenheim bombers. Were being used as the wrong plane. They were using the wrong cameras with wrong lenses, and most of the photographs were not usable because of condensation. So the English became humble, and they got a consult with Sidney Cotton, who was an Australian maverick. He was an expert in photo reconnaissance. Stein mapping flights over Germany before the war in an Electron. He convinced them with difficulty that they needed to use Spitfires, and with difficulty because they were in short supply. Later on, they used Mosquitoes, and then, of course, when we got into it, P-51s. They were flown without guns or armor, so as to get a maximum speed. And Spitfires at 360 miles an hour and an altitude of 30,000 feet. Its only defense was speed. And he got them to use modern 5 cameras on each plane, heated. The cockpit wasn't heated, but the camera compartment was. And he gets some new enlarging equipment. Some things are no bigger than a millimeter on a photograph, like a dot, and use a photogrammetric comparators for measuring. His ideas were accepted and adopted, but he wasn't. He was let go because they considered him to be an arrogant, you-know-what, a bully. And of course, he was an Aussie, and it kind of hurt their pride that he knew more about it than they, the English, did. And you might remember, what, 3 or 4 years ago, Joe Thompson came and talked to us. He was the photo recon pilot in World War II, flying the P-51. And of course, they had to fly flat, straight, and level, like you do on a bombing run. And you couldn't take evasive action. So for flak or fighters, so it must have taken nerves of steel and very good impulse control, because wouldn't you think that it would be your impulse if you saw a flak burst in front of you but you couldn't do that, because then the pictures wouldn't be any good. And some flew as low as 30 meters, like a Pinamunda, to get the clearest pictures. There's the 3 levels of interpretation. The first was at the airfield that the photo recon plane landed at. The photos were developed immediately and passed on to operations. And given information like, is the ship still in the harbor? Was the target factory hit overnight in the raid? And as the war progressed, these PIs, photo interpreters, moved closer and closer to the front in Europe. The second phase was at Medmenham, where the interpreters completed their analysis every day. Photographs came in, they worked on them until they got them done and reported, which meant irregular hours. It might be